Welcome to another episode of Image Rights by N. Mashinini. This is a monthly podcast about image rights, what image rights are, what they protect, and the contemporary issues that affect image rights today. I'm so excited about today's topic because we are going to be talking about catfishing. And I'm sure a lot of us know what catfishing is all about. However, I have invited someone who is really digging deep into this topic, and she is Ndyulo, who is currently a master's candidate at Rhodes University, and her LLM thesis is in the field of ICT law, and she has a keen interest on the intersection of human rights and digital communications, and her current research focuses on the catfishing phenomenon and how it affects the right to identity, also known as image rights. Welcome to the show, Lisa.
Thank you.
How are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks. And you?
I'm good. I'm doing well. I'm just a bit worried about this catfishing issue, though, because I know that it has been, for decades, it has been an issue. We've seen catfishing being exposed on MTV, on Neil Schulman's show. And I'm just worried a bit that we still see catfishing quite a lot today, especially in South Africa. There's a lot of stuff written about news articles on catfishing incidents in the country. So I wanted to bring you on to the show to speak to our audience about this particular phenomenon. And the first question that I have for you, which I think would be a good point to start to help the listeners to gauge this topic, is what exactly is catfishing?
Okay, so loosely, catfishing is pretending to be someone else online by using a person's pictures combined with fake information such as a fake name, fake surname, fake birth information, along with other identification pointers. And usually people participate in this conduct with the intention to fall in love with someone, or to get back at someone else, or just simply as a joke, or just because they're bored. So through my research, I found that legally catfishing is defined as a form of impersonation. But under South African law, there isn't a definition yet. However, in US law, catfishing is simply impersonating another person by creating a fictitious account on social media.
Wow. So I'm interested in how I'm realizing that the extreme conditions under which catfishing takes place. I mean, on one hand, you said some people are hoping to fall in love, but others, it's about love gone wrong. But
yeah.
what I wonder is where do we see catfishing mostly in South Africa? What kind of platforms? Where do we see this happening a lot in South Africa?
So from my findings, I found that the platform that's most popular for catfishing in South Africa is Facebook. But there's this really interesting cross-pollination where you'll find that a perpetrator will go download images or screenshot somebody's content off Instagram to use it on a fake account on Facebook.
Wow. And do we see any of this also on dating sites? I would imagine dating sites would be a popular one.
Yes. So that is quite true. So dating sites such as Tinder as well. But I'm not quite sure that there's been any reports of that happening, say, like on Tinder in the South African space, considering the fact that the purpose of Tinder is to meet people in person. But I've spoken to some people who then have told me that they know that there are accounts on Tinder that are fake, because they, particularly see someone whose picture they know, and then when they speak to the person, they realize that it's not the real person depicted by that account.
Interesting. So just in your bio, it mentions there that your current study in your master's is about catfishing and how it relates to the right to identity or image rights. Okay. So my next question is then what does catfishing actually have to do with image rights from a legal perspective?
So catfishing interferes with the person's freedom to enjoy, use, and control their identity or their image, and therefore infringes on their right to identity, which is a protected personality interest. A perpetrator of catfishing basically disturbs the protected relationship a person has with their identity or image because they use it without consent and in a manner that portrays the person inauthentically and in a false light. So legally, there are two ways of infringing on identity, and that is by appropriation for a commercial gain and by falsification. On the one hand, appropriation of identity for commercial gain can be defined as using a person's identity without permission for a financial purpose. And we've seen cases before our courts where this infringement manifests as using someone's image in an advertisement, for example, or in a magazine without their consent. And then on the other hand, there's falsification, which occurs when a person uses an aspect of a person's identity in a manner that portrays them contrary to their true self or in a false light. So to explain how catfishing fits into these infringements of identity, I can break the act of catfishing up into two parts. So there's a part of catfishing where a person takes another person's image without consent, and that would amount to appropriation. And in the US, states recognize that identity can be infringed by merely taking a person's identity without permission or using their picture, for example, without permission, even if there isn't a commercial purpose linked to the reason why they've appropriated it. As long as a perpetrator gains some advantage, a victim will have a claim. And this can be contrasted to the position in South Africa where there has to be a financial benefit linked to the appropriation of someone's identity. And then there's the second part of catfishing, which is where a person uses the image they've appropriated in a fake account. And that part amounts to falsification because the account that the victim's picture is attached to is not real, firstly. And then secondly, it doesn't reflect a true representation of the victim. So in essence, one can say that at its core, catfishing involves both appropriating a person's identity and falsifying it on social media.
You've mentioned quite a lot in terms of the different categories that you would break it into under the protection of image rights and identity. I'm just, what I find interesting here is the issue of commercial exploitation, because I know you mentioned we've had case law dealing with commercial exploitation in the context of advertisements. But have we seen case law coming out on catfishing in particular?
Unfortunately, no.
Wow. Okay. So it's interesting. I say this because I know that there are a number of news articles that I've seen talking about situations where people have been victims of catfishing, particularly in Cape Town. And sometimes it's so frustrating for the victim because it is something that usually happens between one party who is maybe in South Africa and another party who is not in South Africa because of the whole social media element that is involved in this catfishing issue. So now I'm thinking about recourse. And what I want to ask next is, how do social media platforms protect victims and hold perpetrators of catfishing accountable if ever they do hold them accountable?
So that's really interesting because social media platforms have terms and conditions, right, or terms of use. So this is when you sign up onto a social media platform, you are presented with a little blurb that asks you, do you agree to these terms of use or terms of service? And you will say, yes, I agree. And then you go about your jolly life and you create an account. So these terms and conditions actually explicitly prohibit impersonating other people or pretending to be someone who you're not. And I guess they expect, the platforms expect users to be aware of these rules or prohibitions, and they expect them to also comply. But as we know, people do not comply with a lot of the rules contained in the terms of service or terms of use. So to remedy this, platforms offer what I'd like to think of as a self-monitoring function, where users have an unspoken responsibility to report any accounts that display inauthentic behavior or accounts that break the rules, so to say. And they also have, AI technology that review that are automatic, firstly, and they're designed to weed out all the problematic behaviors. And then they also have manual or like review mechanisms through content moderators. But I believe that, as far as I'm aware, I believe that the automatic review technology and the content moderators are mostly there to deal with content and not really offending accounts. So what happens then is, again, we go back to the thing I was talking about, where if a user reports an account that they are aware is a fake account, an investigation will be conducted into the alleged fake account, and then the platform will seek proper verification, so such as a legal ID document to show that you are so-and-so and you look like the picture you displayed. And the result is that any account that is found to be misrepresenting their identity will probably be deactivated.
It sounds like a lengthy process. I'm just having thoughts about how takedown notices and such requests to social media platforms are sometimes not even honored, especially when you do not have much claim to the particular content or account that you are claiming is probably infringing on someone's rights. I think the other challenging problem is that when you think about the fact that social media platforms are accessible all over the world, there are jurisdictional issues that come up when it's a matter of protecting image rights in particular, because image rights are not directly regulated under international law, but what we see is that the different jurisdictions also have different approaches when they attempt to protect image rights or the right to publicity or the right of identity. So what are the dangers then of being involved in a catfishing situation? Because what I'm getting at here is that I'm so looking at this catfishing situation as having three parties involved, where you have a catfish and the person who is targeted by the catfish, as well as the person whose image is used by the catfish. So my question to you is, what are the dangers of being catfished, being a catfish, as well as being the victim of image rights infringement in this situation?
So you're very right. There are three people involved here, or three parties involved. And each have their own cons, so to say, that are attached to being in that position. So the dangers of being catfished, let me start with being catfished, range from financial loss to psychological and social damage. On the financial loss end of things, a catfish might swindle the person that they've deceived, or depending on the relationship that the person who's catfished formed with the catfish, the deceived person might fall victim to further crime cybercrime, such as extortion or blackmail, because they were manipulated into exposing personal material with the catfish, who they probably would not have shared that information with were it not for the fake account. And then on the psychological and social damage end of things, a person who's catfished might be personally or socially humiliated, ashamed for falling victim to such a scam. And those feelings can lead to extreme depression and other conditions. There's an example of a US case of a 13-year-old girl called Megan Meyer, who committed suicide after being catfished. And I think this case was the beginning of a series of events that drew legal attention to catfishing and cyberbullying back in 2006-07. But flowing from this, today there are still cases like this, and there are many more cases involving teenagers who commit suicide after being catfished. And a lot closer to home, sometime last year there was a case of an adult man who committed suicide because he was being blackmailed by a catfish that he had shared very personal images with. So catfishing does have very drastic implications for the person who's been catfished, but the dangers that come with being a victim of catfishing, so the person whose images are used to catfish, are that the person might face reputational damage because it is their face and image that is ultimately attached to that account and its conduct. And the person whose face is known to represent that account is the victim, or the person whose images were stolen for the account. And then the dangers of being a catfish are really legal. So a person who is caught catfishing might attract legal action for damages. So people might sue them. And if the perpetrator catfishes somebody who's in the US, for example, they might attract charges for electronic impersonation, because catfishing is actually criminalized in California and in Oklahoma, amongst other states. But in California, a verdict of guilty on this charge might be followed by a sentence of a maximum of a year in prison, or a fine of up to $1,000. And then in Oklahoma, there are punitive damages for catfishing a person of up to $500, including legal costs and any other damages a court might award. Bringing it back home, in South Africa, a claim for damages for the infringement of identity would largely depend on the evidence presented to a court, and a court will order what it deems just and equitable in those circumstances.
Would this overlap with a violation of the right to privacy in South Africa?
Yes, it would, because there's an ongoing debate as to whether falsification and misappropriation are infringements of identity or privacy.
Interesting. And in the criminal law space, what are the ramifications for the catfish in the South African context?
So my research hasn't gone as far as looking at catfishing in the criminal law space. But if I take a wild guess, if you were to frame catfishing as misrepresentation, in essence, as a type of fraud, I think that a person could get arrested for fraud because of catfishing. But as far as I know, and I might be extremely wrong, our law doesn't provide for catfishing in either civil law or criminal law.
Yes, true. And this is why I'm actually touching on this point, because I imagine that even if we do try maybe a charged for fraud, this would only be in the context where the catfish has actually swindled someone out of their money, but not so much where you're doing this in the situations relating to maybe trying to fall in love or revenge situations. Depending on how far it goes, of course, I think it would be a lot harder to lay a charge against someone for fraud in such contexts.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. It's quite interesting. The next question that I have for you, and this will be our last question in closing, is as you are developing your master's thesis on this particular topic, what would you like to see come out of South Africa in particular in terms of regulating catfishing? Because you've just mentioned that in South Africa, we don't explicitly have laws dealing with catfishing as they do in other states of the United States of America. What would you like to see come out of the South African context in this catfishing scenario?
So I think there are two things mainly. And I think the first would be a development of our common law in such a way that appropriation of identity should recognize, or our law rather should recognize appropriation of identity without it being attached to a financial benefit. Because catfishing sometimes has very little to do with the financial benefit. People don't catfish solely to swindle people. But that is one of the reasons why people would catfish. Sometimes people catfish just for the sake of it because they're bored. They have nothing better to do. So, if you're caught up in something like that, you'd want to be able to approach a court and say, look, I am very offended that somebody would use my identity or my image in this way, even if they didn't do something, commit fraud. I'm appalled at the fact that, and I'm injured at the fact that somebody would just take my image without consent and use it in this manner, without even touching on the fact that it falsifies that person's true nature, right? And then the second thing is perhaps legal reform. So what I've seen is that with the American statutes in the states that I've mentioned, so California and Oklahoma, for example, is one of the states that have, I think it's possibly the only state that has a catfishing liability act. So it's a special act designed to deal with catfishing only and this kind of behavior linked to catfishing. So I think it would be a reach to ask our legislature for such. So on the law reform side, I think what the Californians have done is to add segments that deal with catfishing or impersonation to their existing law. So we could do the same thing either in our ECT Act by adding a provision that says, if you act in this way or impersonate others online, you'll be liable to damages or, another act that could possibly have the same tone or effect would be the Cybercrimes Act. They could add something that says that impersonating other people is, against the law or is unlawful, 1, 2, 3, and you will be liable to damages.
I would believe that under the Cybercrimes Act, this could be captured under the online fraud provision, because there is a provision like that. It could possibly also fall under malicious content, but it's highly unlikely if there isn't any exposure of a person's private parts or anything like that in any of the pictures that are uploaded by the catfish. So it would basically be something that would probably fall under the sections relating to fraud, forgery, and so forth. There is someone who once said to me they once turned into a catfish momentarily when they were trying to find out who was cheating with their man.
Oh, no.
I think about such situations that I think a lot of people do not think about the ramifications, the legal ramifications of being a catfish. And usually it's tied to something that is very personal to them, without considering the effect that it has on everyone who it can impact. Because I think a lot of people think, oh, I just use a picture I got online to hide behind this picture, and then I can quickly do what I want to do. But they don't think about how it will affect the victim of image rights violations, the person whose picture is being used for this catfishing purpose. And I think a lot of the times we focus more on the people who are being targeted with the catfishing. So the person from whom they want to get money, or the person who they're trying to attract, or something like that. But we forget that catfishing has a very huge impact on the protection of people's image rights, the protection of people's identity. And I would actually say that it is not exactly like identity theft, but it is touching on the tip of the iceberg of those kinds of crimes dealing with identity theft, especially depending on how far it could go and for what means the catfish is using someone's image. It's quite interesting. So what I also find interesting is that in what you would like to see coming out of South African law in this topic, is that you do mention issues relating to holding people accountable, holding catfish accountable. But what are the trends? Have you seen maybe in your research, what are the trends of actually finding the catfish? Because I think this is one of the most challenging things about online and social media life, is that sometimes people are basically untraceable, especially if a platform like Facebook is not willing to divulge who the account holder is. What are the trends there? Is it easy to find someone who is a catfish?
So in my research, I don't really focus much on unmasking the identities of people, but the bit that I do touch on is if, for example, a person, becomes alive to the fact that their pictures are being used to catfish, and say they now want to hold somebody accountable for this. They can approach a court for an order directing a platform to reveal who is behind that catfish account. And, that is hoping that that person doesn't catch wind of that and they suddenly decide to deactivate the account. But it would be hard to figure out who is catfishing you on your own without contacting the platform or seeking some legal assistance, unless the person who's catfishing you comes clean and they're an honest person. Yeah.
I think maybe we need Niv to come and help us with our own catfish.
Yes. We need a whole investigation team dedicated to unmasking catfish.
Lisa, so where can our audience reach you to maybe either collaborate on this research that you're doing or ask any questions about this? Where can they reach you on social media?
So I have a Twitter account, and my handle is at Lisa, and Latima, Lisa Latima.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Lisa. I really had a good time discussing this catfishing issue, because it's something that I do recognize that although it is not such a new topic, it is still a very much unexplored topic from a legal perspective. And I wish you all the best for completing your master's thesis.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you.
This podcast series is based on research supported by the National Research Foundation of South Africa, grant number 121887. But the views and opinions expressed in this series do not reflect the views and opinions of the National Research Foundation, its management, or its governance structures. Until next time, control your image rights.